All right. Hello and welcome, welcome listeners to the first episode of the Failure to Launch podcast, where we take you through all the mistakes, failures, and explosions that make space exploration today possible. My name's Quinn.
I'm Chris.
So I think to kind of start this off, just to give you and all of you, the audience, an idea of this is there's a lot going on in the space industry right now. There's a whole lot of companies, a whole lot of money and cool things going on. And I feel like that's getting a lot of play, but I also feel like there's a whole lot of space history that a lot of people are not aware of. People are probably aware of like Apollo, Sputnik, Laika, and the ISS, things like that. Uh, and that really kind of disappoints me sometimes because there's a whole lot to learn about early space history and just how they really didn't know anything about what they were doing at the start. And that's not really a bad thing. Like, I don't know, whenever I was a kid, I remember there were these at like the Air and Space Museum, there were always these videos of the first planes being built, and there were like cars with umbrellas on top of them that hopped up and down and looked all crazy and wacky like that. And that's kind of how it was with space at first. Whenever you're getting into something new, whenever you're going into a new frontier, really the best thing you can do is just throw it at the wall and see what sticks. And that's really what I want to be talking about with this podcast. Like I said before, my name's Quinn. I'm an aerospace engineer, and I like to think I know a lot about space.
And
I'm going to
I'm
be the
Chris.
one.
I'm a meathead and I'm a hobbyist and I love this kind of stuff, but I know nothing compared to this man.
I'm going to be doing my homework, and I'm going to be bringing it to Chris and to you for your education and entertainment. So yeah, animal testing is something that's basically always been done as long as there's testing. If you want to figure out what something will do to a human, but you don't want to actually put that human at risk, chances are good you're going to put an animal through it first, just in case. Back in 1783, the Montgolfier brothers were the first. These were the first guys who ever developed the balloon. Like you've heard of them, right?
Like the hot air balloon, right?
Exactly, yeah. And their first test of their balloon, like they did small tethered flights with like one of the brothers on board,
Right,
but
right.
they never really got that high. So their first untethered actual free flight was done with a couple of animals just to test what would happen, because back then like 1,500 feet was high altitude. So they launched it with a sheep, a rooster, and a duck. And
Was this like a scenario where two entrepreneuring brothers come to the local farmer and they're like, "Hey, can we borrow your animals? It's for science."
the animals were actually the better choice because this wasn't just two entrepreneuring dudes. They weren't down on their luck or anything. They had major support from the French government, and the king actually proposed sending prisoners instead of the animals, which
It's
they wisely turned down. I
it's
mean,
pretty wild.
in hindsight, in the hindsight of the modern era, nothing would have happened. Those random prisoners just would have been the first people to ever fly, and gotten a wonderful view. At the time, like they were worried that the animals would suffocate. They were worried that they would freeze to death. So I don't know much about the Montgolfier brothers, but at least good on them for sending animals first. 1,500 feet was high altitude back then, and that's actually why they sent the duck. They theorized that, like, hey, since the duck is used to the extreme altitudes, it will be our control. It'll probably survive. The rooster was added because it's a bird, but it doesn't fly, and they wanted to see if that had some impact for some reason. And the sheep was the simulated pilot because they thought that it would react similarly to a human. Um,
Wearing nice warm wool clothing.
exactly, yeah. And it might have, honestly, because from Etienne's account of the flight after they landed, the animals were fine and the sheep had pissed in the cage. And just that idea, to me, that's what I've always been so interested in with, space and aerospace and all that, is the pushing the boundaries and finding the cutting edge and going beyond it. It's so incredible in the moment, But the crazy thing about looking back at the history is that it always looks ridiculous because we have the benefit of knowing better. And the thing you always have to take into consideration with any of these kind of testing, especially with space, is that they just didn't know.
Yeah, it
Um,
is. It is weird thinking back on it because like in the modern day, you can take all this stuff kind of for granted when it's written in your textbooks, right? Where it basically becomes a like a real solid facet of your understanding of the world that we live in, like from a really early age. And like they didn't have this wasn't something that was just written down back then, right? Like this is something they
exactly.
had to still find out. So
So anything that we take for granted had to be sat down and figured out by someone at some point. And as much as it's common sense for us, at some point it wasn't common sense. Someone had to sit down and figure it out. Someone had to figure out 1,500 feet altitude will not kill people. I think it's kind of the same way with the space industry right now, because there's all kinds of, like, there's new rockets coming out, there's new manned exploration. The ISS is getting bigger. There's new stations being launched, and it all rests on initially animal testing that really no one knows about. And I don't know about you, but I've always been really interested in that kind of pushing the boundary. It's something that we today, we always have the benefit of hindsight, that we can look at the crazy things they were doing back then and go, of course, 1,500 feet wasn't going to kill that sheep. They had nothing
right.
to worry about. If those prisoners had flown, they'd have gotten an amazing view and nothing else. But the thing I always come back to with especially space exploration is they just didn't know, and
Well, yeah, I mean,
uh,
it harkens back to the time when we thought that the air would be sucked out of our lungs and our blood boiled or something to that effect. Our heart would stop working because we wouldn't be affected by Earth's gravity once we were in space or something to those effects.
mhm. Hold that thought. Um, from the really good book, Packing for Mars, aerospace professionals at the time were gripped with almost universal foreboding at the prospect of cutting loose from gravity's hold. What if man's organs depended on gravity to function? What if the pumping of his heart failed to push blood through his veins and instead merely churned it in place? What if his eyeballs changed shape and compromised his visual acuity? If he cut himself, would his blood still coagulate? They worried about pneumonia, heart failure, debilitating muscle cramps. Some fretted that without gravity, signals from floating inner ear bones and other cues to the body's position would be absent or contradictory. So, like, after World War II, just as space was starting to become an interesting thing to explore, like, they were really worried about this. A lot of the early descriptions out of sci-fi and like those urban legends that continue to persist, those actually, there was never really any real. So going back to the late 40s and early 50s, like, just as World War II is ending and just as space is starting to become interesting, the scientists in charge of this were really, really worried about what space and zero G and high altitude would do to the human body. And because of that, we're going to get to this topic of our episode today. Because,
Finally, the monkeys.
exactly, because at least in the US, a couple of scientists actually figured out how they were going to test this. And it involved a lot of monkeys named Albert.
All of them? They're all Albert? Were they numbered
All,
Alberts?
yes. So there were Alberts 1 through 6. And they were all launched on literal Nazi V2s that were recovered in Operation Paperclip. Because, so one of the many things that Operation Paperclip grabbed was, the famous thing is it grabbed Werner von Braun and all of the other Nazi scientists who were behind the rocketry program. And a lot of these guys formed the backbone of early, American rocketry. But what doesn't get a lot of play is that the Americans were actually very, very successful in grabbing up as much spare parts and in production V2s as possible. They wound up, by some accounts, they wound up with enough to build 50 complete V2s. And that's what the early zero G testing rockets would be. The problem was there were only 50 rockets, and so many different departments and companies wanted to test on these rockets. They actually had to make them a lot of ride shares. So these monkeys would be launching inside modified nose cones with all kinds of different equipment. They had a very small allotment of mass. They had, incredibly small space they could fit the monkeys inside of. And I'm going to send you a link. I'll send you a picture of the rocket they were launching with, of the first rocket that Albert 1 launched with. And what you might notice at the top there, for the listeners, there's kind of the normal nose cone of the V2 is heavily modified. And that's because the first V2 rockets to launch these monkeys were actually were actually modified to be the nose cone of the X2 rocket plane. And this is just part of like all of the rideshare stuff. The monkeys weren't the priority here. They were just kind of shoved in as an afterthought.
Man, poor Albert's just crammed up there in the nose cone.
You'd be surprised because he didn't really feel it. And I don't know if Albert really cared, because every single Albert monkey was heavily sedated and strapped to like a hospital gurney for the entire flight. And because it was a rideshare, they had very little space to work with and very little time before their launch. So that was his capsule.
Oh my god.
Yeah, it's for listeners. It's a box. It's very poorly welded. It's bumpy. Like, this is something that any welder could put together over a weekend, which is what happened. The scientists found a nearby metal shop and got someone to build them a space capsule for their little sedated monkey. And one of the weirder things there is that they initially picked the monkeys. These were rhesus macaques, and they were picked because they were thought to have reflexes similar to humans, and that they would be very personable and trainable. So they would be a good representation for human pilots. But then they ended up just sedating them all, so the most data they could get out of it was heart rate, breathing, that kind of thing. There were a lot of Alberts, and they were all numbered, which should probably give you a bit of an idea of how Albert 1 is going to do. Albert 1 launched in 1948, except he was already dead whenever he launched. Because, see, like I said, all the monkeys were sedated, and they were hooked up to sensors so they'd be able to, so the scientists would be able to see how they'd react to the flights. And a few minutes before liftoff, Albert 1's all of his sensors flatlined, and they figured out after that, basically because of the incredibly cramped little capsule, and like the just to fit them inside, they had to like bend the monkey in half basically. And they figured out that they shoved him in there, and they closed off his airway, and he suffocated. And here's the part you're not gonna like, because like I said, it was a ride share. So even though the monkey was dead, there were a lot of other systems and sensors. There were a lot of other scientists who really wanted that rocket to launch, and it was already on the launch pad. It was already fueled, so they launched it with the dead monkey.
Oh geez.
Yeah, I mean, otherwise the rocket worked great. Yeah, it made it all the way up into space. It didn't enter orbit or anything like that. It just did a suborbital flight, and they were able to record a couple of minutes of zero G and its effects on a dead monkey. But don't worry, or maybe I shouldn't say that. Like,
oh no.
For what it's worth, he would have died either way.
Well,
Because
that was my first thought, was that when he's crammed up in this little capsule, I mean, even before he croaked, it's just like he's not gonna. If that rocket's going into upper orbit, he's going to suffocate.
His capsule was, at least on paper, like, quote unquote, heavy air quotes, airtight. And they were only up in space for a couple of minutes at best. But the reason he would have died anyway, and this is going to be a pattern, is that on re-entry, after the pod separated, the parachute failed, and his capsule slammed into the ground and exploded on impact. I don't know. I guess maybe his early death spared him splattering in the desert.
Rest in peace, Albert 1.
Small miracle, yeah. Albert 2 was launched shortly after, and he actually survived his launch. And it was deemed a partial success in hindsight, because the capsule was able to transmit its findings in real time, so they were able to get a good few minutes of science back, basically, of his heartbeat and his breathing and blood pressure and all that, of a doped up monkey in 0G. And what they found was that there was basically no change in readings at all. Like 0G, this blew their mind at the time. 0G didn't boil his brains. It didn't, pop his heart. Unfortunately, like I said before, this will be a pattern. Albert II died whenever his parachute failed and his capsule smashed into the ground. Like I said, partial success. And things would not get better through the Albert series. Albert III died when his rocket exploded on the launch pad. Albert IV died when his parachute failed. Same thing with Albert V. Albert VI launched fine, made it to space, sent back data, survived re-entry, and his parachute worked. But it took them too long to find him in the desert, so he died of exposure.
He's just cooked alive in the pod?
Less cooked alive and more just like, like any person winding up in the desert. He was actually alive whenever they found him. He just died shortly after, before they could get like medical aid to him.
Right. I think it's kind of wild how it took them effectively 6 iterations of the rocket to get the parachute mechanism to deploy properly.
It's honestly like, and I work with parachutes, so I'm of course very biased in thinking that they're important. But in both the U.S. and the Soviet programs, there are things like this that repeatedly happen when, like, the biggest problem with the early rocket tests wasn't the rockets. It was peripherals. It was things that they didn't think of. It was things like parachutes and heat shields and all things like that. Basically things they didn't think they would need that much, which kind of gets back into what we were talking about with space, which is they had no idea what they were doing, and all of the rules that we know now, that heat shields are important, parachutes are important, they figured that out the hard way by splattering monkeys across the desert. But they did wise up a little bit, because they changed a couple of things. After Albert VI, after the Albert program, partially because they ran out of V2s, and partially because the V2 was like incredibly finicky to work with and incredibly unsafe, the Americans they swapped to a smaller rocket called the Aerobee that was specifically designed for 0G testing,
sending monkeys into orbit.
Exactly, yeah, like a really have you ever heard of a sounding rocket?
You may need to enlighten me on that fact.
Okay, so sounding rockets, they're still around today, and they've been around, basically since the Aerobee, and they're really tiny. They're maybe a couple of inches across. They're very long, and they're basically designed just to get a tiny payload up into space, and then it falls back down. They have maybe like 2 stages. I'll send you a quick picture to give you an idea. For those listening, it's basically a really tiny, really simple rocket meant to just get something into space and get it back down. And that meant that, among other things, Project Albert now had its own rockets. It didn't have to ride share with anyone. And the other thing they did, maybe this is just me, maybe this is just superstition, but they wisely decided to change the names of the monkeys. And the first time they did that, it actually worked. Patricia and Michael, they were both successfully launched in 1952 and became the first American animals to survive spaceflight. I know you mentioned it before, but I want to kind of circle back to what we were talking about with the ethics of sending animals, and especially of anesthetizing them before they launch them. There's actually pretty good records going back of these tests, and especially of the memoirs of these scientists who launched all of these monkeys. So this is going to be a quote from the very good book on the topic, Animals in Space. From the monkeys' point of view, the thing that we put them in was a seat that they were strapped to, and they didn't have room to wiggle at all. They were totally restrained because our space was as cramped as it conceivably could be. So was the weight limitation. If they were awake and conscious, this would be a cruel thing to do to the animal if it wasn't necessary. For those reasons, we did anesthetize the animal. It meant that we had to try to extrapolate what reactions one would get conscious and awake in this situation compared to asleep and anesthetized. But if there were really any gross, serious physiologically disturbing fractions, they should show up, even under those circumstances. It was a first cut. No animal had ever experienced anything like this before. So they made a good point in that quote. Because all these monkeys were anesthetized, they had no idea of what they were feeling. They had no idea of any kind of mental changes or how an animal would react in zero G. All the scientists could tell from these monkeys was, yep, it's still alive. But initially, that's all they were after. They were just trying to figure out, like we said before, if the heart would pop, if their brains would, bubble out of their ears.
But going back to the Albert program, I guess then, unless we're technically turning this into the Patricia and Michael program at this point.
Oh no, it ended right after them.
Right.
They were the last. They were the first monkeys to survive, and they were the last monkeys launched.
So basically, after that point, we were good. Like we were confident enough that we could send a man into orbit, and he wouldn't immediately vaporize as previously feared.
Exactly. Yeah, and like that's really all Project Albert could tell them because even Patricia and Michael, they were also heavily sedated the entire time. So the most info you could really get was just to look at a screen and say, yep, monkey's still alive. They were able to get a little bit of information, but not from the monkeys because in the capsule with the monkeys, they actually launched two mice in like a little plexiglass ball. And there's actually good video you can find of these mice flailing around in zero G. It shows that, among other things, like zero G can be really disorienting for an animal. The first mouse showed that. But it also showed that, there were ways around it. Because the other mouse in the container was actually kind of clever. It found a small crack in the side of the ball and it managed to hook a claw in there. And for the entire flight, while they were in zero G, this one is holding on for dear life and keeping itself
Right.
anchored to the wall.
Right. I remember seeing like those low gravity tests with cats and them demonstrating their ability to constantly right themselves in
Yeah.
zero gravity.
Yeah, with those they wanted to test. Part of it was just the old, a cat always lands on its feet kind of thing, and from which they like it wasn't just because of the joke. They extrapolated that cats have very good control of their body as they're falling. They have so maybe they would better be able to orient themselves in space. In practice, I believe it's videos of Soviet tests are most common. They just wind up spinning themselves in circles. I'm going to quote from Animals in Space. The entire series of experiments showed that the stresses imposed by a brief rocket flight into the ionosphere and by the operation of this particular escape capsule system are well within the range of tolerance of the animals used, and probably of man as well. More important still, the work showed that tests of physiological and even psychological reactions can be conducted by proxy and in miniature scale by using animals. So, in the US, this paved the way for both human testing and further animal testing because they figured out zero G isn't going to kill you and that it's not going to make you completely unable to operate.
I might be jumping ahead a few points here, but having the thought of how did they necessarily extrapolate from their findings that zero G wouldn't kill you to better understanding like how orbital mechanics and like the atmosphere and stuff works? Because like you said before, like they didn't understand like the principles of needing things like heat shields and stuff like that. So
Oh, they didn't really care about the why. They just wanted to know the what. And they didn't care whether it was, cosmic radiation. Like they every scientist had their bugbear, their thing that they thought would be the big killer, whether radiation, cold, suffocation, all kinds of wind, like high altitude winds blowing things off course. I like of course I'm minimizing it to say that they launched the monkeys and figured out they didn't die. Like there was like on these rideshare programs, they were doing all kinds of tests on all kinds of systems all the way up. But at the end of the day, really all of their dumb fears proved completely unfounded because the monkeys and the mice showed no physiological changes whatsoever. Their heartbeats didn't so much as flutter until they died.